Facts about Moses that many people do not know. Number 1. Moses asked God to remove his name from the book of life. What happened for Moses to make this statement, and what can we learn from this? This took place at the same time as the worship of the golden calf. The parable of the golden calf sheds light on human nature and the tendency of individuals to move away from their commitment to God. It is ironic that while Moses was on Mount Sinai receiving the 10 Commandments from God, the Israelites were breaking the first commandment, which states that thou shalt not have any gods before me. The Israelites' impatience with Moses on Mount Sinai led them to come up with the idea of creating a new god to go up before them or worship. In order to achieve this, they melted down their gold jewelry and used it to construct the golden calf out of it. The people's impatience caused them to turn to Aaron, and they gave him the responsibility of serving as their spiritual guardian in place of Moses. Aaron obediently obliged with a request by transforming their golden earrings into a golden sculpted calf, which was a behavior that was specifically prohibited. Then they began to indulge in revelry, worshiping the idol, while also engaging in immoral behavior, such as eating, drinking, and playing. Then the Lord said to Moses, "Go down at once, for your people whom you brought up from the land of Egypt have corrupted themselves. They have quickly turned aside from the way which I commanded them. They have made themselves a molten calf, and have worshipped it and sacrificed to it, and said, 'This is your God, O Israel, who brought you up from the land of Egypt.'" Exodus chapter 32, verses 7 through 8. Moses descended the mountain with the 2 tablets of the testimony, met Joshua on the way, and came to the people as they were carrying on their sensual, idolatrous feast. In righteous anger, he broke the tablets of the law as a witness of what the people had already done. Exodus chapter 32, verses 31 through 34. So Moses went back to the Lord and said, "Oh, what a great sin these people have committed! They have made themselves gods of gold. But now, please forgive their sin. But if not, then blot me out of the book you have written." The Lord replied to Moses, "Whoever has sinned against me I will blot out of my book. Now go, lead the people to the place I spoke of, and my angel will go before you. However, when the time comes for me to punish, I will punish them for their sin." Moses did not sugarcoat the severity of the sin committed by the people, or attempt to downplay its impact. They were responsible for glorifying a deity of gold. Despite the enormity of the people's sin, Moses asked for forgiveness. This was an appeal to God's mercy and grace. Moses begged God to forgive Israel because of his own self-sacrificed identification with the sinful people. If God refused to forgive, Moses asked to be damned as a sacrifice for his sinful people. Moses felt that Israel had sinned so terribly that the blood of a goat or an ox couldn't cover it. It had to be a man who suffered in their place. Therefore, he offered to be blotted out of God's book if it could somehow rescue the people. God said no to Moses' request, but we can say that God was looking forward to the sacrifice of one greater than Moses, who would give himself for the people, bringing full and complete atonement. Of course, Jesus had the same sacrificial heart when he died for our sins. God agreed to spare the nation, but reserved the right to judge individual sinners. Now therefore go, lead the people to the place of which I have spoken to you. This was God's promise to stay faithful to Israel and to keep His presence with them. My angel shall go before you. Number 2. Moses and the Nihustan idol. The biblical books of King refer to the image of a serpent coiled around a pole as the Nihustan. The image is described in the book of Numbers. Following their deliverance from Egypt, the people began to complain to God about the conditions of their lives, and as a direct response, God dispersed among them fiery serpents. Many of the people ended up passing away, and many more were dying. In response to Moses' prayer, God commanded that a bronze serpent be lifted on a pole, and promised that anyone who looked at the bronze serpent would be healed of the snake bite they had received. The Israelites started worshiping the fiery serpent that Moses had made out of bronze sometime in the time period between Moses and Hezekiah. The bronze serpent mentioned in connection with Hezekiah's reforms, but the Nihustan worship could have been taking place long before Hezekiah. 2 Kings chapter 18 verse 4. He removed the high places of pagan worship, broke down the images, memorial stones, and cut down the Asherim. He also crushed to pieces the bronze serpent that Moses had made, for until those days the Israelites had burned incense to it, and it was called Nihustan, a bronze sculpture. Even though it is easy to see how something that brought miraculous healing could become an object of worship, it was still blatant disobedience to God's commands. The bronze serpent was God's method of deliverance during the incident recorded in Numbers 21. There is not the slightest hint that God ever intended for it to have any further application. It's interesting to note that the literal translation of the word Nihustan is piece of brass. It's possible that Hezekiah gave it the name Nihustan so that people would be reminded that it was just a piece of brass. It did not contain any power at all. Even in the situation described in Numbers 21, it was God who brought about healing, not Nihustan. A powerful lesson for all of us to learn from Nihustan is that even good things and good people have the potential to become idols in our lives. All of our adoration, praise, and thanksgiving should be directed solely towards God. Nothing else, regardless of its amazing history, is worthy. Number 3. Why was God going to kill Moses in Exodus? God picked Moses to free the Israelites from Egypt's servitude and guide them to the Promised Land. Moses is also known as the giver of the law and the Old Covenant's mediator. The encounter with God at the burning bush, where God invited Moses to be the savior of his people, was a key event in Moses' life. The Lord promised Moses that he would deliver his people from Egypt and bring them into a land of abundance, that is, Canaan. 40 years after fleeing to Midian, Moses returned to Egypt at God's command. He went with his wife and sons, Zipporah, Gershom, and Eliezer. But before Moses could deliver the message, he had to learn obedience himself. He had failed to circumcise his own son, Gershom or Eliezer, possibly because of Zipporah's opposition. Exodus chapter 4 verses 24 through 26. But it came about at the overnight encampment on the way that the Lord met Moses and sought to put him to death. So Zipporah took a flint and cut off her son's foreskin and threw it at Moses' feet. And she said, "You are indeed a groom of blood to me." So we left him alone. At that time she said, "You are a groom of blood because of the circumcision." Moses was about to be extinguished by God because of his wrongdoing. The nature of Moses' trespass is not revealed clearly in Exodus chapter 4, verses 24 through 26, but the surrounding circumstances provide significant hints. The sacred rite of circumcision, which symbolized the Almighty's covenant with His chosen people, appears to have been overlooked by Moses. This could have been due to his surrogate Midianite tribe's pressure. Zipporah, who obviously found circumcision unpleasant, may have also convinced him not to circumcise his son. This would explain her rage. She believed that by shedding her son's blood, she had spared her husband's life. Moses had disobeyed God's commandment, yet God is now saying to Moses, "I don't just use everyone. I use those who are holy and upright." You and I know that we're not holy and righteous in and of ourselves, and that we are righteous through Christ alone. But that doesn't mean we continue to sin so grace can abound. Moses was going to go back and represent God, yet he had not done what a righteous representative of God would do, even with his own children, and so God sought to slay Moses. God is very severe in His judgments, because He's letting people know, "I'm not a God to be trifled with." Therefore, as Moses is going to be the deliverer, he had to work on areas of his own life that he was out of step with, because God is holy. This level of judgment is also applied to the Israelites. God shows us that He is not going to use an unrighteous people to judge other people. Moses was unfit to serve as a spiritual leader because of his unresolved sin, and the problem had to be remedied before he could carry out his task properly. As soon as Zipporah completed the task, the Lord let him go. In short, God was planning to slay Moses since he was supposed to teach the Israelites God's law, but he was breaking it himself. Number 4. Moses was not allowed to enter the promised land. Sometimes the punishment does not seem to fit the crime, and at first glance, Moses striking a rock in the desert out of frustration with the Israelites does not appear to be a just reason for him to forego seeing the promised land. After all, he'd seen the 10 plagues, led Israel out of Egypt and across the Red Sea, delivered the 10 commandments from Mount Sinai, and won many of Israel's battles. So why would God allow a single rock strike in Meribah to keep Moses from entering the land that God had promised Israel? The Israelites complained to Moses about their lack of water. They also put the Lord to the test. So Moses cried out to the Lord for help, saying, "What shall I do with this people? They are almost ready to stone me." Then the Lord said to Moses, "Pass before the people, and take with you some of the elders of Israel, and take in your hand the staff with which you struck the Nile, and go. Behold, I will stand before you there on the rock at Horeb. There you shall strike the rock, and water will come out of it, so that the people may have something to drink." And Moses did so in the sight of the elders of Israel. Exodus chapter 17, verses 4 through 6. Water flows from the rocks, providing a drink for the Israelites. In essence, the Israelites approached Moses with a problem. Moses went up to God. God gave Moses specific instructions. As Moses followed, water began to flow. Consider what happens at the second Meribah, when Moses becomes frustrated and disobeys God. Numbers 20 contains the second miracle. The Israelites arrive in the Zin desert near Kadesh. The Israelites again complain to Moses about a lack of water. Numbers chapter 20 verses 1 through 13. Then the Israelites, the whole congregation, came into the wilderness of Zin in the first month, in the 40th year after leaving Egypt. and the people lived in Kadesh. Miriam died there and was buried there. Now there was no water for the congregation, and they gathered together against Moses and Aaron. The people contended with Moses and said, "If only we had perished when our brothers perished in the plague before the Lord. Why have you brought up the assembly of the Lord into this wilderness to die here, we and our livestock? Why have you made us come up from Egypt to bring us to this wretched place? It is not a place of grain or of figs or of vines or pomegranates, and there is no water to drink." Then Moses and Aaron went from the presence of the assembly to the doorway of the tent of meeting, tabernacle, and fell on their faces before the Lord in prayer. Then the glory and brilliance of the Lord appeared to them, and the Lord spoke to Moses, saying, "Take the rod, and you and your brother Aaron assemble the congregation, and speak to the rock in front of them, so that it will pour out its water. In this way you shall bring water for them out of the rock, and let the congregation and their livestock drink fresh water." So Moses took the rod from before the Lord, just as he had commanded him. And Moses and Aaron gathered the assembly before the rock. Moses said to them, "Listen now, you rebels. Must we bring you water out of this rock?" Then Moses raised his hand in anger, and with his rod he struck the rock twice, instead of speaking to the rock as the Lord had commanded. And the water poured out abundantly, and the congregation and their livestock drank fresh water. But the Lord said to Moses and Aaron, "Because you have not believed, trusted me, to treat me as holy in the sight of the sons of Israel, you therefore shall not bring this assembly into the land which I have given them. These are the waters of Meribah, contention, strife, where the sons of Israel contended with the Lord, and he showed himself holy among them." Moses had grown tired of God's people. They contested him, contested God, and contested Moses' administration at every bend. At first glance, it appears that God is punishing Moses severely. After all, Moses had faithfully followed God's instructions up to this point. Couldn't God just let this go? Did he go too far? First, we must understand that the first striking of the rock foreshadows Christ. 1 Corinthians chapter 10, verses 1 through 5. "For I do not want you to be unaware, believers, that our fathers were all under the cloud, in which God's presence went before them, and they passed miraculously and safely through the Red Sea, and all of them were baptized into Moses, into his safekeeping as their leader, in the cloud and in the sea. And all of them ate the same spiritual food, and all of them drank the same spiritual drink, for they were drinking from a spiritual rock which followed them, and the rock was Christ. Nevertheless, God was not well pleased with most of them, for they were scattered along the ground in the wilderness, because their lack of self-control led to disobedience, which led to death." Moses obeyed God by striking the rock in Exodus 17. But Moses disobeyed God by striking the rock rather than speaking to it in Numbers 20. The incident in Numbers 20 was Moses' second strike on the rock, the first being in Exodus 17. As a result, we teach that Moses was punished for striking the rock twice, rather than striking it twice in Numbers 20. According to 1 Corinthians, God intended the rock in the desert to be a representation of his Son, Jesus Christ. In Exodus 17, the Lord told Moses to strike the rock in order to establish a picture of Christ as our Redeemer. Christ is our rock and cornerstone, who has been struck for our sake, and he will bring forth streams of living water, as stated repeatedly in Psalms and Isaiah. Furthermore, the book of Hebrews states that Christ died once and for all, and that no further atonement for sins is required. So in the Exodus 17 scene, the Lord intended Moses to strike the rock in the desert only once, symbolizing Jesus being sacrificed only once to bring us salvation. Later in Numbers 20, the Lord instructed Moses to only speak to the rock, so that the image created in Exodus 17 could be preserved. When Moses chose to strike the rock a second time, he threw a wrench into the Exodus 17 picture. We would have been perplexed by the distorted picture if God had not corrected Moses' error, concluding that Christ, the rock, had to be sacrificed repeatedly for our salvation. As a result, God chastised Moses to ensure that we correctly understood the image of the rock, preventing Moses from entering the promised land. During the process, the Lord created a new image to help people understand salvation correctly. By refusing to let Moses enter the promised land, the Lord demonstrated that we cannot enter salvation, meaning the promised land, through the works of the law, meaning Moses, but only through the work of Jesus, that means by Joshua, which is the name Yeshua, or Jesus. When God instructed him to speak to a rock in order to obtain water for the nation, he struck it in rage. He reacted in rage rather than with poise, and as a result, he was barred from entering the promised land.